Hello everyone, welcome to a new session in your module Build Asset Management. Today, the topic that we are going to cover is benchmarking. Here you have the overview for that session, the main learning objectives. First, you will understand the concept of benchmarking, and we will contextualize the importance of this technique in management and for asset management in particular. You will learn about the different levels and the different types of benchmarking, and we will explore the application of benchmarking in asset management. Well, the initial question is clear. What is benchmarking? Here you have an interesting definition for benchmarking. Benchmarking can be defined as a process for improving performance by constantly identifying, understanding, and adapting best practices and processes followed inside and outside the company and implementing the results. So, from that definition, you can understand that benchmarking is a management process to improve performance by observing and measuring best practice and implementing this observed best practice into our own organization. Actually, the main focus of benchmarking is not only on best performance, but on best practices, and it's expected that through these best practices we will achieve best performance. So, mainly, what we are trying to achieve by using benchmarking is to identify, understand, and adapt the outstanding practice from other organizations. So that what we want to do is to measure our own performance against the performance of the best in class organizations in order to understand what we can do better. So here you have some key aspects of benchmarking definitions. Obviously, learning is the core concept. We usually start by measuring our own performance, our own processes, and compare with the processes, performance, etc. from other organizations. So, based on that comparison, we can identify the room for improvement and implement the actions to achieve these improvements. And the last aspect to consider is continuity. This is a continuous process. Now I'm going to provide some contextualization for the concept of benchmarking. The emergence of this concept is connected with the idea of quality control developed by Edward Deming in the 1950s. But these type of methods were rarely used in the Western countries until the early 1980s, when some companies such as IBM, Motorola, and Xerox became pioneers in using benchmarking processes. In the 80s and 90s, benchmarking became a widespread tool among different firms. So in the early 90s, 50% of the Fortune 1000 organization used benchmarking as a management tool to achieve competitive advantage. In that table, you can see the evolution of benchmarking. The first generation was connected with reverse engineering, which is basically to analyze the structure, function, and operation to understand better the technological principles and identify room for improvement. So, this first generation was most connected with engineering. It's in the second generation when benchmarking started to be connected with management. This second generation is called competitive benchmarking and can be described as the continuous process of comparing a firm's practice and performance measures with that of its most successful competitor. So initially, benchmarking started by comparing our own performance with our main competitor's performance. The third generation is called process benchmarking, and this is more focused with the observation and investigation of business processes. The idea is that by understanding, observing, and measuring business processes, we can understand better the routes that lead to better performance. Later, we observe the development of strategic benchmarking, which involves the observation on how other organizations compete. And with the emergence of globalization, we find global benchmarking when we compare with competitors across the globe. So, as you can see in that figure, we can identify different perspectives of benchmarking depending on the main focus and the main impacts. So, we can find benchmarking focus on organizational competitiveness, on operational effectiveness, on functional excellence. But the main objective is to integrate these different types of benchmarking to achieve sustainable competitive advantage. Now we are going to explain the different types of benchmarking that we can observe. The first one is known as strategic benchmarking and is based on the need to improve overall performance. The focus here is on observing long-term strategies and general approaches. So we will consider high-level aspects such as core competences. This type of benchmarking is used when an organization wants to realign its business strategy. The second type is performance benchmarking, and this is also known as competitive benchmarking. By using this type of benchmarking, we will consider our positions in relation to some characteristic. By using this type of benchmarking, our organization will consider its performance in relation to the performance of key products and services in its competitors, usually from the same industrial sector. This type of benchmarking is suitable to evaluate the levels of performance in some key areas or activities. A third type of benchmarking is called process benchmarking, and we will use this type when we want to improve some specific critical processes and operations. What we are observing here are the best practice and the best operations from other companies. This type of benchmarking is suitable to achieve improvements in some key processes and obtain short-term benefits. Then we have the generic benchmarking or functional benchmarking, which is more connected with the observation of innovation from other organizations. In that case, the organization can look to benchmark with partners from different business sectors or different areas of activity. This type of benchmarking is particularly useful to improve or innovate in activities and services, or even to import the inclusion of services that are being offered in other sectors. Also, we can consider internal benchmarking, which is basically to benchmark inside the organization. The main advantage of internal benchmarking is that we have access to rich sources of data and help us to perform a fair comparison between different business units in the same organization. The good thing is that we can identify good practices and spread these good routines and expertise across the organization. Also, this can push health competency between different departments. External benchmarking usually englobe any type of benchmarking when we are going to use an outside organization to compare. We normally use this type of benchmarking when our organization is not big enough, or we can find examples of good practice inside, and we need to observe these good practices outside. Commonly, we can combine both internal and external benchmarking. And finally, we can also consider international benchmarking. That is basically when we benchmark with best practitioners that are located in other countries. Here we need to consider carefully the cultural and national differences. And this type of benchmarking is applicable when the aim of the organization is to achieve a world class status, when we want to compete internationally. Here you can observe the process of implementation of benchmarking. First, we will plan what type of benchmarking we are going to implement and how we are going to carry out this benchmarking. Second part is analysis. This is about to measure our own performance, processes, etc., and compare and analyze the differences with the unit of units that we are using to benchmark. Then we have to integrate the results in order to understand better the key aspects of the benchmarking, and from this integration of results to decide which actions we need to take, and then to observe how the implementation of the different actions is working in an organization. As we said at the beginning of the session, this must be a continuous process. Here you have detailed steps for each of the phases, for the planning, analysis, integration, and action. Well, what are the main advantages of benchmarking? The first one is to identify our current position and understand better which should be our priorities to improve our performance and business results. The second advantage is that we can compare our processes, strategy, activities with other companies or internally among our departments. Also, benchmarking helps in installing a culture of monitoring the progress, a culture of measuring, which is pretty useful for the organization. And obviously, benchmarking leads to a process of continuous improvement. Clearly, if we execute benchmarking correctly, this will bring competitive advantages for the organization. But also, we need to consider some barriers to effective benchmarking. The first one is uncooperative sources. If the people responsible for an existing best practice don't want to help others, it's unlikely that the benchmarking will be successful. Second is strained personal relationships. In that case, if the manager attempting to replicate a best practice has a difficult relation with expert sources, successful benchmarking is unlikely to happen. The third barrier is internal competition. If an organization discourages cooperation between departments, it's unlikely that they are going to have incentives to copy or to be copied. The fourth barrier is the overemphasis on innovation. If an organization idealizes innovation and scoffs at copying, benchmarking will not occur. And finally, cranky copiers. If the managers in charge of replicating best practices are not capable to absorb new knowledge, or they are afraid to change, or excessively focused on preserving their own status, they will probably fail in implementing benchmarking. In asset management, and particularly in physical asset management, benchmarking is a critical activity. Particularly, benchmarking is a very good instrument for asset management monitoring and reporting, and this is efficiently used in real estate. In asset management, many times we use benchmarking to compare with past performance because we can enhance the future values of properties if we know better how they have performed in the past and understand their competitive positioning in the present. But to do that with effectiveness, we need data. And despite the potential benefits, sometimes it's difficult to gather or to gain access to the right data. On the other hand, and as a critic, the conditionings managers' compensation on a benchmark portfolio's performance just partially protects them from risk and actually boosts their incentives of managers to invest in risky assets. Finally, you have here some key points for a successful implementation of benchmarking. First one is understand pretty good our own processes to identify the best practices in the industry our organizations belongs to choose the right benchmarking partners and techniques, to make sure about the benchmarking partners' willingness to share information, to keep confidentiality of critical information, to create a culture of involvement of management and employees in the analysis and implementation of best practices, to put the focus on practices and processes, to understand benchmarking as a continuous process, to have a commitment towards the adoption and implementation of best practices, to create and empower a benchmarking team, to have the willingness to change according to the findings from benchmarking processes, to make sure that we test the new implementation and that the results of these new implementations based on benchmarking are verified, and stick to the process and follow the right steps to do benchmarking. Here you have some references. I use it for this presentation. Thank you so much for your attention and looking forward to seeing you soon in our synchronous session. Goodbye.